Sunlight streaming through the panoramic windows of the penthouse played across the flawlessly polished surface of the massive redwood table. Andrew Winston, a man whose name had become synonymous with success in the high-tech world, leisurely sipped his morning espresso while watching New York City wake up. At 53, he looked impeccable, a slender figure dressed in a Tom Ford suit, with gray at his temples adding charm and gravitas. Andrew smiled, recalling the previous evening. The charity auction at the Metropolitan Museum of Art had been a huge success, and his $10 million donation had received ovations. Winston Tech saves the world. He could already picture that headline on the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers. The light tinkle of a crystal bell signaled the arrival of Jeffrey, his loyal butler. "Good morning, sir. Your breakfast is ready. Anything else?" "Good morning, Jeffrey." "No, thank you, that will be all," Andrew replied, heading to the breakfast table where a perfectly arranged meal awaited him: truffle omelet, whole grain toast, and freshly squeezed orange juice. As Andrew ate, his thoughts were already on the day ahead. Today was crucial: the presentation of the new Winston Tech project that promised to revolutionize artificial intelligence. The project, which the team had been working on for the past 2 years, was set to elevate the company to new heights, leaving competitors far behind. Finishing his breakfast, Andrew headed to the elevator. As he descended from the 78th floor, he scrolled through the latest news on his smartphone. Headlines blared his name and his company's. Winston Tech breaks records on the stock market. Andrew Winston, Person of the Year by Time. Winston Tech's artificial intelligence, the future is here. Exiting the building, Andrew got into the awaiting black Rolls-Royce Phantom. "Good morning, Mr. Winston," greeted the driver. "Good morning, Frank. To the office, please," Andrew replied, settling into the plush leather seat. On the way to the office, Andrew made several phone calls, discussing the final details of the upcoming presentation with his team. "Sarah, make sure everything is ready for the demonstration." "I want it to be perfect," he told his executive assistant. "Of course, Mr. Winston. Everything will be top-notch," Sarah replied. Arriving at the Winston Tech headquarters, a majestic glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan, Andrew got out of the car. A group of journalists was already waiting at the entrance. "Mr. Winston, can we ask a question?" Andrew stopped, smiled, and nodded, ready to answer a few questions. "Mr. Winston, is it true that the new Winston Tech project will change the world?" "Our new project is the result of years of research and development. We are confident that it will open new horizons in artificial intelligence." "But will it change the world?" "That's for you, our users, to decide," Andrew answered with a confident smile. "What about rumors of a possible merger with tech giant?" "No comment. Today we are focused on the presentation of our new product." "Thank you for your attention." Andrew politely nodded and headed toward the building's entrance. Entering the spacious lobby, Andrew was greeted by his team. Sarah, his executive assistant, Jason, the technical director, and Michael, the chief financial officer, were waiting by the elevators. "Good morning, team. Ready to change the world?" Andrew asked enthusiastically. "Always ready, boss," Jason replied with a broad smile. Ascending to the top floor where Andrew's office was located, the team proceeded to the conference room for final preparations for the presentation. "So, let's go over the key points one more time," Andrew said, taking his seat at the head of the table. The next hour was spent discussing the details of the presentation. Andrew listened intently to his team's reports, asked questions, and made final adjustments. His mind worked like a well-oiled machine, analyzing every detail, anticipating potential questions and objections. "Great, team. I think we're ready," Andrew concluded. "Sarah, please make sure everything is ready in the main conference room. Jason, double-check all the technical aspects of the demonstration. Michael, ensure that the financial forecasts are up to date." The team dispersed to carry out their tasks, and Andrew remained in his office for one last call before the presentation. "Mr. Chen, good morning. Or is it already evening in Shanghai?" Andrew smiled upon hearing the voice of one of Winston Tech's largest investors. "Mr. Winston, hello. Yes, it's already evening here. I'm looking forward to your presentation. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. Our new project will unlock incredible opportunities," Andrew said confidently. After a brief but productive conversation, Andrew ended the call and took a deep breath. He glanced at the clock, Only half an hour remained until the presentation. Andrew walked to the window of his office, which offered a breathtaking view of New York City. He looked at the city that once seemed like an unreachable dream and now lay at his feet. He remembered arriving here 25 years ago with just a suitcase and big ambitions. Now he was on top of the world, and today was supposed to solidify his position. A light knock on the door pulled him from his reverie. "Come in," Andrew said. Sarah entered the office. "Mr. Winston, everything is ready. Guests are starting to arrive." "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be there in a minute." Andrew took one last look at his reflection in the window, adjusted his tie, and headed for the door. Passing his desk, he paused momentarily, gazing at a photograph of a young man with a wide smile and burning eyes. It was a picture of him taken on the day WinstonTech was founded. Andrew smiled slightly, recalling that day full of hope and ambition. "We made it, kid," he whispered to the photograph and left the office. The main conference room at WinstonTech was packed to capacity. Journalists, investors, company partners, all were waiting for Andrew Winston's appearance and the announcement of the new project that promised to be a breakthrough in the tech world. When Andrew entered the room, all eyes were on him. He radiated the confidence and charisma that had always been his trademarks. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome," Andrew began his speech. "Today, we stand on the brink of a new era. An era where artificial intelligence not only assists us in our daily tasks, but becomes a true partner in solving global problems." Over the next hour, Andrew presented the new WinstonTech project, an AI system capable of analyzing and forecasting global economic and climate trends with unprecedented accuracy. The demonstration of the system's capabilities elicited enthusiastic applause from the audience. After the presentation, Andrew answered questions from journalists and investors, his confident and clear responses only enhancing the impression of what had been seen. "Mr. Winston, how do you assess the potential impact of your new system on the global economy?" asked one journalist. "Our system offers unprecedented opportunities for forecasting and managing economic processes. We believe it will help prevent crises and stabilize the global economy," Andrew replied. The presentation ended on a high note. Andrew shook hands with investors and partners, received congratulations from colleagues. It seemed that this day had become another triumph in his illustrious career. Returning to his office after the presentation, Andrew felt a surge of energy and satisfaction. He sat at his desk and began to browse the early reviews of the presentation online. The headlines were filled with enthusiastic comments. "WinstonTech is changing the game again. Andrew Winston's AI is the key to a stable global economy. WinstonTech's stock soared 15% after the new project announcement." Andrew smiled as he read these headlines. He felt that all his efforts, all the sleepless nights, and risky decisions had finally paid off. He was on top of the world, and it seemed nothing could shake his position. But fate has a way of surprising even those who think they are in control. A week after the triumphant presentation, Andrew sat in his office, reviewing reports on the initial rollouts of the new system. The results were impressive, but something troubled him. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what, but he felt a vague sense of unease. The phone rang. It was Michael, his CFO. "Andrew, we have a problem," Michael's voice sounded alarmed. "What happened?" "TechInvest has just announced they are pulling out of our project. They're withdrawing their investment." Andrew felt a shiver run down his spine. TechInvest was one of the key investors in their new project. "But why? We showed excellent results." They didn't give a clear explanation. They just said they're revising their investment strategy. Andrew frowned. This was strange and completely unlike TechInvest. They had always been reliable partners. "All right, Michael. Let's meet in an hour and discuss this," Andrew said, ending the call. He leaned back in his chair, trying to process the situation. Losing one investor wasn't a disaster, but it was a troubling sign. Andrew decided to personally contact other key investors to make sure this was an isolated incident. He spent the next few hours making phone calls. With each call, his anxiety grew. Although no one else announced they were pulling out of the project, he sensed uncertainty in his partners' voices. Something had changed, but he couldn't quite figure out what. That evening, Andrew sat in his home office, analyzing the situation. He opened his laptop to review the financial reports again when he noticed a flashing notification for a new email. The sender was unknown, but the subject line made his heart race. Do you remember the price of your success? Andrew hesitated for a moment before opening the email. Inside was only one sentence. It's time to pay the piper, Mr. Winston. He felt a cold sweat break out on his back. This email, it couldn't be just a coincidence. Andrew closed his eyes, trying to calm himself, but the memories he had long tried to forget came flooding back with renewed intensity. The next morning, Andrew arrived at the office earlier than usual. He hoped to sort out the situation before the usual daily rush began. But as soon as he entered his office, he realized something was wrong. There was an envelope on his desk. An ordinary white envelope with no markings. Andrew carefully picked it up, feeling his pulse quicken. He opened the envelope and pulled out a sheet of paper. It bore a symbol he hadn't seen in years but instantly recognized, a stylized sandglass, the symbol of the ancient Union. Andrew felt the ground slip from under him. He sank heavily into his chair, unable to tear his gaze away from the symbol. The memories he had so diligently buried in the depths of his mind suddenly resurfaced with terrifying clarity. Andrew closed his eyes, and the memories surged back, vivid and painful, as if everything had happened yesterday. He saw himself again, a 22-year-old MIT student, sitting in a small rented apartment in Cambridge. Textbooks, scribbled sheets of paper, and empty energy drink cans were scattered around him. A tattered poster of Steve Jobs and his famous quote, "Stay hungry. Stay foolish," hung on the wall. Andrew remembered looking at that poster every day, feeling a mix of inspiration and despair. He was hungry, oh yes. Hungry for success, recognition, the chance to prove everyone, especially himself, wrong. Especially his father. "You dream too much, Andrew," his father's voice echoed in his head. "The world isn't waiting for you with open arms. You think you're special? There are thousands like you." Andrew clenched his fists, recalling those words. His father, a successful lawyer, had always considered his dreams of a tech business a mere fantasy. "If you want to be successful, go into law," he would say. But Andrew knew he was destined for something more. He remembered the sleepless nights spent working on his projects, the sacrifices of parties and dates, immersing himself completely in his studies and idea development. Yet despite all his efforts, breakthroughs eluded him. His startups failed one after another, investors turned away, and his classmates were already receiving job offers for major companies. "I'll prove them all wrong," he would whisper to himself every night, gazing at the nighttime Boston skyline. "I'll become the greatest innovator of our time. I'll change the world." And then he appeared. A man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, with just a hint of gray at his temples and piercing dark eyes. Andrew met him after another unsuccessful presentation to investors. "You're Andrew Winston, aren't you?" the stranger asked, and Andrew heard tones in his voice he had never heard before. Respect. Interest. Expectation. "Yes, that's me," Andrew replied, feeling his heart start to race. "I have an offer for you," the man said, handing over a business card with a single symbol, a stylized sandglass. "My name is James, and I represent an organization that can give you everything you've dreamed of." They sat in a small cafe near the campus. James spoke, and Andrew listened, feeling his excitement grow with every word. "We see potential in you, Andrew," James said. "We believe you can truly change the world, and we are prepared to give you all the resources you need." "But why me? Why now?" Andrew asked, still unable to believe his luck. James smiled. "Because you are willing to do anything for your dream. We can give you everything you want, Andrew. Wealth, power, success. But remember, everything in this life comes at a price. And one day, we will come for our payment." Andrew felt a shiver down his spine. "What price?" he asked. "That depends on how successful you become," James replied. "But believe me, the cost will match your success." Deep down, Andrew knew something was off. That you couldn't just get everything you dreamed of without a catch. But the desire for success, the need to prove everyone wrong, his father, his classmates, himself, was stronger. "I agree," he said, looking James in the eye. James smiled and extended his hand. "Welcome to the ancient Union, Mr. Winston." Andrew shook the extended hand, feeling a mix of euphoria and fear. At that moment, he was sure he could handle any consequences. After all, wasn't that what his father had taught him? That in the world you had to fight for your place in the sun? I'll manage, he thought. Whatever it takes, I'll achieve success and prove I am the best. The memories receded, and Andrew found himself back in his luxurious office at the top of the skyscraper. He looked out at the city, a city he once dreamed of conquering. Now this city, like the whole world, lay at his feet. But the sense of triumph was replaced by a bitter realization. His perfect world, meticulously built over the years, was starting to crumble. And the most terrifying part was that he understood he had laid the foundation for this destruction on that distant day when he decided that the price didn't matter. At first, his impulse was to run, to leave everything behind, his company, his wealth, his reputation, and disappear. To start a new life somewhere on the other side of the world, where the ancient Union couldn't find him. But deep inside, Andrew knew it was an illusion. You couldn't escape from people like the ancient Union. He spent a sleepless night pacing his penthouse, trying to find a way out. Every sound made him flinch, every shadow seemed like a threat. By dawn, Andrew felt like a cornered animal. But at that moment, looking at the rising sun piercing through the skyscrapers of New York, he made a decision. No, he told himself. I won't give up without a fight. I built this empire, and I won't let them destroy it. From that moment on, his struggle began. A struggle for survival, to preserve everything he had built, and possibly for redemption. The first step was to gather information. Andrew knew that contacting his usual sources directly would immediately attract the ancient Union's attention. Instead, he started acting secretly. He hired a team of anonymous hackers through the dark web, assigning them to find any information about the ancient Union. At the same time, he began studying old archives, looking for mentions of the mysterious organization in historical documents. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Andrew practically moved into his office, working day and night. His assistants began to notice changes in his behavior. He had become irritable, paranoid, often canceling important meetings at the last minute. "Mr. Winston, is everything okay?" Sarah, his loyal assistant, asked one day. "Everything's fine, Sarah," he replied, not tearing his eyes from the computer screen. "Just a lot of work." But Sarah saw the dark circles under his eyes and the nervous twitching that had appeared lately. One evening, when Andrew was returning home after yet another meeting, he noticed that his car was being followed. His heart raced, and adrenaline surged through his veins. "Frank, I think we're being tailed," he said to his driver. "I noticed, sir," Frank replied, keeping his composure. "Don't worry, I know what to do." The next half hour turned into an exhilarating chase through the streets of New York. Frank skillfully maneuvered between cars, evading the pursuit. When they finally lost their tail and arrived at Andrew's penthouse, both were drenched with sweat from the tension. "Thank you, Frank," Andrew said, trying to steady his shaking hands. "You just saved my life." "Always at your service, sir," Frank replied with a slight bow. This chase became a turning point for Andrew. He realized he could no longer trust anyone except his closest people. He began preparing for the worst. The following weeks were filled with feverish activity. Andrew secretly transferred a significant portion of his assets into cryptocurrency, set up several shell companies in offshore zones, and prepared escape routes in case he had to disappear quickly. But the closer he got to unraveling the mystery of the ancient Union, the more his life fell apart before his eyes. It all started with Michael, his financial director and longtime friend. That day, Andrew was waiting for him at an important meeting, but Michael never showed up. At first, Andrew felt irritation. It was completely unlike punctual Michael. "Sarah, where's Michael?" he asked his assistant. "I don't know, Mr. Winston." "He's not answering calls," Sarah replied with concern in her voice. Andrew tried calling himself, but Michael's phone was turned off. An uneasy premonition began to gnaw at him from within. By evening, with no word from Michael, Andrew could no longer contain his panic. He personally went to Michael's home, but the apartment was empty. No signs of a struggle, no note, just emptiness. "Michael, where the hell are you?" Andrew whispered, sinking onto the couch in his friend's living room. His hands trembled as he dialed the police. The following days passed in a haze. Andrew barely slept, constantly checking his phone, hoping for news. He couldn't concentrate on work, his thoughts constantly returning to Michael. Where was he? What had happened to him? And most importantly, Was it connected to the ancient union? The police offered no reassuring answers. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Winston," they said, but Andrew saw in their eyes that they themselves didn't believe in success. A week later, when Andrew had started to come to terms with the thought that he might never see his friend again, something even more horrifying happened. It was late evening, and Andrew was sitting in his home office, trying to work, when the phone rang. It was his mother. "Andrew," her voice trembled. "Lucy. Lucy is missing." The world around him seemed to stop. Lucy, his younger sister, his childhood best friend, the only person who had always believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. "What do you mean missing?" His voice cracked. "Mom, what happened?" "She didn't show up for work. For 2 days. There's no one in her apartment. The police, they haven't found anything." Andrew felt the ground slipping away from beneath him. He sank to the floor, still holding the phone to his ear, listening to his mother's sobs, unable to say a word. When the call ended, Andrew remained still, sitting on the floor of his luxurious penthouse. Tears streamed down his face, and one thought kept circling in his head. "It's my fault. It's all because of me." For the first time in a long while, Andrew allowed himself to truly cry. He wept like a child, mourning not only Lucy's disappearance but all the pain and fear that had accumulated over the past weeks. "I can't take it any more," he whispered into the void. "I give up. You've won." At that moment, he was ready to give up everything. His company, his fortune, his life, just to bring Lucy and Michael back. He considered calling the ancient union, surrendering, accepting any terms they set. Andrew spent a sleepless night sitting on the floor of his office, staring at a single point. He felt empty, broken, ready to surrender. But as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, something changed. Andrew looked at the photo of Lucy on his desk. Her smiling face, her eyes full of life and hope. "No," he said aloud, his voice hoarse from the night of tears. "I can't give up. Not now." Andrew struggled to his feet. Every movement was a struggle, as if he had aged 10 years in one night. But a new fire had appeared in his eyes. "I'll find you," he whispered, looking at his sister's photo. "I'll find both of you, no matter what it costs me." He approached the mirror, looking at his reflection, tired, with red eyes from crying, but determined. "You'll make it, Andrew," he told himself. "You have to make it. For Lucy. For Michael. For everyone who believes in you." From that moment on, Andrew changed. Fear and despair were still with him, but now they were joined by steely determination. He was no longer just a businessman trying to preserve his empire. Now he was a brother and a friend, ready to do anything to save his loved ones. He was no longer afraid of the ancient union. Now he was ready to challenge them. "You've taken everything from me," he thought, getting into his car. "Now it's my turn." And with these thoughts, Andrew Winston began his real fight against the ancient union, a fight not for money or power, but for the lives of those he loved. The following days for Andrew passed in a state of strange, tense calm. On the outside, he tried to maintain his usual routine, going to work, holding meetings, answering calls. But inside, he was a storm of emotions that he barely kept in check. Each morning, waking up in his huge bed, Andrew would momentarily forget everything that had happened. Then reality would crash down on him like a cold shower. Michael, Lucy, their empty places in his life felt almost physical, like phantom pain. He started his day with a cup of strong coffee, standing by the panoramic window of his penthouse. Looking at the awakening city, Andrew tried to collect his thoughts, planning his actions for the day. But more often than not, his thoughts returned to his sister and friend. "Where are you now?" he whispered, looking at the streets below. "What are they doing to you?" His colleagues noticed the changes. His gaze had hardened, and his voice now had a steely edge. He smiled less and fell silent more often in the middle of conversations, lost in thought. "Mr. Winston, are you all right?" Sarah asked one day when she found him sitting in the dark office after work hours. Andrew looked at her with tired eyes. He wanted to lie, to say everything was fine. But instead, he blurted out, "No, Sarah. I'm not all right. Nothing is all right." Sarah quietly sat down across from him. Her eyes conveyed sincere sympathy. "I can't imagine what you're going through," she said softly. "But know that you're not alone." We're all here to support you." Andrew felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a moment of weakness in front of someone else. "I'm scared, Sarah," he admitted. "I'm afraid I'll never see them again. I'm afraid I won't be able to save them." Sarah gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "You're the strongest person I know, Mr. Winston. If anyone can handle this, it's you." Those words, spoken with such genuine belief, gave Andrew renewed strength. He nodded gratefully to Sarah and, for the first time in a long while, felt that he wasn't alone in his fight. From that day on, Andrew began to act more methodically. He understood that panic and fear were poor advisors. Instead of trying to solve all the problems at once, he broke his task into smaller, manageable steps. First, he enhanced the security around his remaining loved ones. His parents received round-the-clock protection, although Andrew did not explain the true reason for this precaution. He didn't want them living in constant fear. "It's just a new corporate policy," he lied to his mother on the phone. "Nothing serious, just an additional security measure for the families of the company's executives." Next, Andrew began to cautiously probe around the Eternal Union. He used his business connections, asked careful questions, trying to find any information about the organization. But every time it seemed he was getting close to something important, the lead would dry up. It was an exhausting job, requiring immense patience. Every evening, Andrew returned home drained, both physically and emotionally. He spent hours in his home office, reviewing notes, analyzing information, trying to find connections where there seemed to be none. Sometimes, in moments of despair, he would pull out old photo albums. There was Lucy at her graduation, glowing with happiness. And there they were with Michael at the opening of the first Winston Tech office, young and full of hope. These photos pained him, but they also reminded Andrew of what he was fighting for. One evening, while flipping through another album, Andrew came across a photograph he didn't remember. It was of him, much younger, next to a person he didn't immediately recognize. But then the memory hit him like lightning. "James," Andrew whispered, looking at the face of the man in the photo. This was the very James who had introduced him to the Eternal Union many years ago. The man where it all began. Andrew felt his heart start to race. It was a thread he could pull on. He didn't know where it would lead, but it was the first real lead in a long time. From that moment on, Andrew focused all his efforts on finding information about James. He knew he had to act extremely cautiously. One wrong move could not only ruin all his plans but also endanger Lucy and Michael's lives. "I will find you," he whispered every night, looking at the photographs. "I swear, I will find you, no matter what it takes." But the search for information about James proved more challenging than Andrew had anticipated. It seemed that this person existed only in his memories. No traces on social media, no mentions in business circles. This only heightened Andrew's suspicions about James's connection to the Eternal Union. One morning, while reviewing another batch of reports from his private detectives, Andrew came across an interesting detail. An old business magazine featured a photograph from a charity event 20 years ago. In the background, almost unnoticed, was James. Andrew felt his heart race. This was the first real clue in a long time. He immediately contacted the event organizers, hoping to get a guest list. "I'm sorry, Mr. Winston," said the charity secretary, "but we don't keep guest lists for that long. It was 20 years ago." Andrew felt hope slipping through his fingers. But he couldn't give up. Not now, when he was so close. "Listen," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and persuasive. "I understand it's been a long time. But this is very important to me. Maybe you have some photographs or videos from that evening. Anything at all." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the secretary hesitantly said, "Well, we have an old archive in the basement. There are boxes of documents and photographs stored there. But it will take time to go through everything." "I'll pay," Andrew said quickly. "Whatever it takes to hire people to search. It's really very important." After lengthy negotiations and a generous donation to the charity, Andrew gained access to the archive. He personally went there, feeling he couldn't trust anyone else with it. The charity's basement turned out to be a dusty labyrinth of boxes and folders. Andrew spent several days there, sifting through hundreds of photographs and documents. His eyes ached from the strain, His back hurt from sitting in an uncomfortable position for so long, but he didn't give up. On the third day, when hope was beginning to wane, Andrew came across an envelope with photographs. And there, in one of the pictures, he saw what he had been looking for. James stood next to a group of people, and among them was a man Andrew recognized, the well-known businessman and philanthropist Robert Sterling. Andrew felt a shiver run down his spine. Robert Sterling was alive and, most importantly, accessible. It was a thread he could pull on. Returning home, Andrew spent a long time in his office, staring at the photograph. He understood that he was getting close to something important, and it scared him. What if the Eternal Union discovered his investigation? What if they harmed Lucy or Michael because of his actions? These thoughts troubled him. At night, he tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. Images of Lucy and Michael haunted him. He saw their frightened faces, heard their pleas for help. At one point, Andrew couldn't take it anymore. He got out of bed and went to the kitchen. Taking out a bottle of whiskey, he poured himself a glass and went out to the balcony. The nighttime New York stretched out before him in all its brilliance. Millions of lights, millions of lives. Somewhere among those lights were Lucy and Michael. Were they alive? Were they suffering? Andrew felt tears well up in his eyes. "I have to do this," he whispered into the night. "I have to find them, no matter what it takes." But fear held him captive. Fear for his loved ones, fear of the Eternal Union's power, fear of the unknown. Andrew spent several hours on the balcony, wrestling with his fears and doubts. When the first rays of the sun touched the horizon, he made a decision. He would contact Robert Sterling. It was risky, but it was the only way forward. For Lucy, for Michael, for everyone who had become a victim of the Eternal Union, he had to continue. Returning to his bedroom, Andrew finally managed to sleep. His sleep was troubled, filled with nightmares and visions, but when he woke up, his eyes burned with determination. He knew that every step now could be a trap. But he also knew he couldn't stop. Too much was at stake. After taking a shower and getting dressed, Andrew looked at himself in the mirror. He looked tired, but his gaze was steely. "Hold on," he whispered, thinking of Lucy and Michael. "I'm coming for you." Andrew spent a long time preparing for his meeting with Robert Sterling. He carefully planned every word, every gesture. He needed to be cautious not to scare away his only lead, but also persistent enough to get the information he needed. The meeting was set at Sterling's office, a vast penthouse in downtown Manhattan. When Andrew entered the office, Robert greeted him with a smile, but Andrew noticed tension in his eyes. "Mr. Winston, what do I owe this honor?" Robert asked, indicating a chair for Andrew. Andrew sat down, feeling his heart race. He took out the photograph and placed it on the table in front of Robert. "I'd like to talk about this evening," Andrew said, pointing to the photo. "And about the man standing next to you." Robert looked at the photograph, and Andrew saw his face change. The smile was gone and fear appeared in his eyes. "Yeah. I don't know what you mean," Robert said, looking away. Andrew felt hope slipping away. He leaned forward, trying to catch Robert's gaze. "Please, Mr. Sterling, I need your help. This man, James, he's connected to an organization that has caused harm to my loved ones." At the mention of James' name, Robert flinched. Andrew noticed droplets of sweat rolling down his forehead. "Mr. Winston," Robert said, standing up, "I think you'd better leave. I know nothing about this man or any organization." Andrew felt despair overwhelm him. This was his only hope, and it was crumbling before his eyes. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "My sister and my friend are missing. I just want to find them." But Robert was already opening the office door, clearly wanting to end the conversation. Andrew stood up slowly, feeling devastated. He headed for the exit, realizing that he had failed. But when he was already in the doorway, Robert suddenly grabbed his arm. Andrew turned around and saw a mixture of fear and determination in Robert's eyes. "Take this," Robert whispered, placing an old cell phone in Andrew's hand. "And be careful." Before Andrew could say anything, Robert slammed the door shut. Andrew stood in the hallway, clutching the old cell phone in his hand and trying to make sense of what had happened. He felt a mixture of disappointment and renewed hope. What did Robert's gesture mean? What was that old phone hiding? Back at home, Andrew sat looking at the phone for a long time. He didn't know what to expect, but he felt it was important. The hours dragged agonizingly slow. Andrew couldn't eat or sleep. His thoughts were occupied only with this mysterious gift from Robert. It was well past midnight when the phone suddenly rang. Andrew jumped with surprise. His heart was ready to jump out of his chest. With trembling hands, he brought the phone to his ear. "Speaking," he said in a voice hoarse with excitement. "Tomorrow, noon, in Central Park at the Bethesda Fountain," came Robert's voice. "Come alone. And destroy this phone and SIM card immediately after the call." Before Andrew could say anything, the call cut off. Andrew sat stunned, still clutching the phone in his hand. His thoughts were racing frantically. What does Robert know? Why was he so scared? And what awaited him in the park tomorrow? But one thing Andrew knew for sure was that this was his chance. Perhaps his only chance to learn the truth about the Age of Union and find Lucy and Michael. Following Robert's instructions, Andrew smashed the phone and destroyed the SIM card. He then sat at the window looking out at the night city. The meeting was hours away, and Andrew knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. Central Park at noon was full of people. Andrew looked around nervously as he approached the Bethesda Fountain. He didn't know what to expect, but he was ready for anything. Suddenly, he noticed Robert sitting on a bench not far from the fountain. Andrew walked over and sat down next to him without saying a word. "Did you come alone?" Robert asked quietly, not looking at Andrew. "Yes," Andrew replied. "Now can you tell me what's going on?" Robert took a deep breath and began his story. 20 years ago, I was in a similar situation as you are now. I was approached by a man who offered me an incredible business opportunity. He spoke of a secret organization that could change my life. Andrew listened with bated breath. Robert continued, "But something about that offer seemed wrong to me. Maybe serendipity, maybe just luck. I figured it was some kind of stupid joke or, at worst, an attempted fraud. I reduced it to a joke, laughed at their offer, and made it clear in every way possible that I wasn't interested." "And then what happened?" Andrew asked. "They kept up the pace. I started getting strange phone calls, letters. That's when I decided to disappear for a while. I told everyone I was leaving on a long trip, and I hid in a friend's country house. It took a few months before things quieted down." Robert was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "But I couldn't just forget about it. Something about their offer, their insistence, made me start my own investigation. I spent years trying to find information about this organization." "And what did you find out?" Andrew could barely contain his impatience. "The Age Alliance isn't just a secret society. It's a network that has infiltrated every aspect of life. Politics, business, science, they're everywhere. They offer success, wealth, power. But the price is always too high." Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. He thought of Lucy and Michael. "How do they operate? How do I contact them?" he asked. Robert shook his head. "It's not that simple. They choose who to contact. But there is a way to get their attention." He pulled a small business card from his pocket and held it out to Andrew. It bore the same symbol, a stylized sand clepsydra. "If you really want to contact them, post this image on a billboard downtown. They'll see it and come themselves." Andrew took the business card, feeling his heart beating faster and faster. "But before you do that," Robert continued, "think carefully. These people are dangerous. They will stop at nothing to get what they want." Andrew nodded, realizing the gravity of the situation. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. You took a risk in telling me all this." Robert stood up, preparing to leave. "Be careful, Mr. Winston. Good luck to you." With those words he vanished into the crowd, leaving Andrew alone with his thoughts and the small business card in his hand. Andrew sat on the bench for a long time, pondering what he had heard. He realized that he was on the threshold of something big and dangerous. But the thoughts of Lucy and Michael kept him awake. That evening Andrew sat in his office, looking at the business card with the symbol of the Century Union. He realized that the decision he was about to make could change his entire life. Maybe even end it. But when he glanced at the pictures of Lucy and Michael on his desk, all doubt vanished. "I'll find you," he whispered. "And if that requires defying the devil himself, I will." Andrew picked up the phone and dialed the number of his advertising agency. "Hi, this is Andrew Winston. I need a billboard. The biggest one you have, right downtown. And I need it ready by tomorrow morning." Hanging up the phone, Andrew took another look at the symbol of the Century Union. He knew that once that symbol appeared on the billboard, there would be no turning back. But he was ready. Ready to come face to face with the organization that changed his life. Ready to fight for the people he loved. "Game on," he said to himself, feeling the adrenaline begin to pulse through his veins. In the morning, the phone rang. It was Sarah, his assistant. "Mr. Winston, the billboard is ready," she said. "But, are you sure it's a good idea? People are already starting to ask questions." Andrew took a deep breath. "Thank you, Sarah. I know what I'm doing. Just trust me." Hanging up the phone, Andrew felt a prick of guilt. Sarah had been with him for so many years, and now he was dragging her into something dangerous without even explaining why. But there was no time for doubt. Andrew put on his jacket and headed for the exit. He needed to see the billboard with his own eyes. Once outside, Andrew immediately felt the stares of passers-by. Some were pointing their fingers at the billboard, others were discussing something animatedly. The symbol of the Age of Union, huge and mysterious, towered over the city like a challenge to fate itself. Andrew stood in the crowd, gazing at his creation. He felt his heart beating faster and faster. Now all that was left to do was wait. The entire day passed in tense anticipation. Andrew tried to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Every bell rang, every knock on the door made him flinch. But nothing was happening. By late afternoon, Andrew's nerves were on edge. He decided to take a walk to clear his head. Leaving the office, he headed towards Central Park. It was getting dark when Andrew noticed someone following him. He quickened his step, turning into the less crowded alleys of the park. The footsteps behind him grew closer. Suddenly, someone grabbed his shoulder. Andrew turned around sharply, ready to defend himself. A man in a dark suit stood in front of him. His face was calm, almost indifferent. "Mr. Winston," the stranger said, "you have our attention. The Century Alliance welcomes you." Andrew felt a chill run down his back. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for and dreading at the same time. "Where's Lucy? Where's Michael?" he asked, trying to keep his voice firm. The man tilted his head slightly. "All in good time, Mr. Winston. First, we need to discuss your unorthodox behavior." He held out an envelope to Andrew. "Here's the address and time. Come alone. And remember, Mr. Winston, you are playing with forces beyond your comprehension." With those words, the stranger turned and disappeared into the darkness of the park, leaving Andrew alone with the envelope in his hands. With trembling fingers, Andrew opened the envelope. Inside was a card with the address and time of a meeting scheduled for the next day. Returning home, Andrew felt a mixture of fear and excitement. He had done it. He had gotten the attention of the Age of Union. Now the real game was beginning. Upon entering his apartment, the first thing Andrew did was check the security systems. Everything was fine, but the feeling that he was being watched never left him. He sat down at his desk and began to prepare for the upcoming meeting. Andrew realized that Lucy and Michael's lives depended on his actions now. He could not afford to make a mistake. The night passed without sleep. Andrew went over possible scenarios in his head, trying to anticipate what awaited him at the meeting with the Age of Union. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the curtains, Andrew was ready. The address on the note led Andrew to an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The building, surrounded by a high fence, looked abandoned, but Andrew felt like he was being watched from the moment he stepped out of the cab. Taking a deep breath, he approached the massive gate. No sooner had he raised his hand to knock than they opened silently. "Welcome, Mr. Winston," came a voice from the speaker. "Come right down the walkway." Andrew walked down the manicured alley, feeling each step echo in his body. The front door of the mansion opened and he stepped inside. The interior of the house amazed him with its luxury. Antique furniture, expensive paintings, crystal chandeliers, everything spoke of the wealth and power of the owners. "This way, please," said the butler, who appeared as if out of nowhere. Andrew followed him into the spacious study. Behind a huge mahogany desk sat a man in his 60s. His gray hair was neatly slicked back, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to see right through Andrew. "Have a seat, Mr. Winston," the man said, pointing to the chair across from him. "My name is Alexander. I represent the interests of the Age of Union." Andrew sat down, trying to remain calm. "Where are Lucy and Michael?" he asked, looking Alexander straight in the eye. Alexander smiled slightly. "Straight to the point, huh? That's commendable. But let's start at the beginning. You have come to our attention in a rather unusual way. Why?" Andrew gripped the armrests of his chair. "You know why. You took my loved ones. I want them back." "Taken?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Winston, the Age Alliance doesn't kidnap people. We offer opportunities. Your sister and your friend made their own choices." Andrew felt anger rising in him. "That's a lie. They would never have left you." Alexander interrupted him. "Are you sure? Think about it, Mr. Winston. Were you so busy with your empire that you didn't notice how they felt in your shadow?" Those words hit Andrew like a slap in the face. He remembered how little time he'd spent with Lucy in recent years, how rarely he'd called Michael. "No," he whispered. "It can't be true." Alexander opened the folder lying in front of him. Lucy Winston, talented biologist, dreamed of her own lab, but always remained in the shadow of her famous brother. He turned the page. Michael Foster, financial genius, worked for you for years, but never got the recognition he deserved. Andrew felt the ground go from under his feet. Was he really that blind? "What did you offer them?" he asked hoarsely. "The same thing we offer everyone," Alexander replied. "An opportunity to realize their potential, to step out of the shadows and become who they've always dreamed of being." Andrew shook his head. "I don't believe you. I want to see them." Alexander sighed. "Unfortunately, that's not possible. They are currently, shall we say, unavailable. But I do have a proposition for you, Mr. Winston." He pulled an envelope from his desk drawer and placed it in front of Andrew. "There's a contract here. Sign it, and you will join the Century Alliance. You will be able to see Lucy and Michael when the time comes." Andrew stared at the envelope, feeling his mind working feverishly. He realized it was a trap, but he also knew it might be his only chance to find Lucy and Michael. "What if I say no?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Alexander shrugged. "Then you'll be out of here, and you'll never hear from the Age of Union again. Nor about your loved ones, either." Andrew felt as if time had stopped. Every option seemed wrong. Signing the contract meant putting his life in the hands of an organization he didn't trust. To refuse meant possibly losing Lucy and Michael forever. He stared at the envelope in front of him, realizing that the next decision could change his entire life. "Yeah," Andrew began, but he was interrupted by a sudden noise outside the door. The door swung open and a woman ran into the room. Andrew couldn't believe his eyes. It was Lucy. "Andrew, don't do this!" she shouted. "It's all a lie." Behind her, 2 guards rushed into the room, trying to grab her. Alexander jumped up from his seat, his face contorted with anger. Andrew, without thinking, rushed to his sister. A commotion began in the room. Screams, sounds of fighting, everything blended into chaos. In that moment, Andrew realized that his worst fears had been confirmed. The Age of Union had indeed kidnapped his loved ones. In the midst of the chaos, Andrew held Lucy's hand tightly, ready to protect her at all costs. In the chaos that followed Lucy's appearance, Andrew lost his bearings. Suddenly, he felt a prick in his neck. The world around him began to blur, and the last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was his sister's terrified face. Andrew didn't know how much time had passed. He woke up in a dark room, bound and disoriented. Next to him were Lucy and Michael, also bound. "Andrew, are you okay?" Lucy whispered. "Yeah, I think so," he replied, trying to focus. "What happened?" "They've had us here for days," Michael said. "We thought it was over, but then you showed up." Suddenly the door swung open, letting in a bright light. Andrew squeezed his eyes shut, but managed to see familiar silhouettes. "Hurry, we have to leave." was the voice of Frank, his driver. The next minutes passed like a blur. Andrew vaguely remembered being released, running through the corridors, hearing gunshots and screams. When they were finally outside, Andrew saw police cars and FBI agents storming the building. How did you find us?" he asked, still not believing what was happening. Frank smiled. "You left clues, remember? Little notes in the office and at home." Once they were safe, Sarah, who was also involved in the rescue, gave details. "Frank found the first note at your house. He immediately realized something was wrong and went to the office. There I found other notes. It took us a long time to figure out what they meant until we put them together." "It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle," Frank added. "An address and a danger warning. We contacted the FBI right away." Andrew was amazed. He'd left those clues hoping for the best, and was very glad he'd believed in his friends and his expectations had been met. In the weeks that followed, a real storm unfolded. Andrew, despite the authorities' attempts to silence him, began to speak publicly about the Age of Union. His story inspired other influential people who had encountered the organization to come forward with their testimonies. The media was abuzz with headlines about a secret society controlling the world's elite. Investigations, arrests, and high-profile trials began. A century-old alliance seemed to be shattered. Its leaders were behind bars, assets frozen, operations halted. Andrew felt he could finally breathe easy. Lucy and Michael were safe. The truth had prevailed. But even in the midst of everyone's jubilation, somewhere deep inside, Andrew felt uneasy. He knew that an organization that had existed for centuries couldn't just disappear. One day, a few months after all the events, Andrew received an anonymous letter. It contained just one phrase: "Time is the most patient predator." Looking at those words, Andrew realized this wasn't the end. Somewhere in the shadows, unnoticed by everyone, the New Age Alliance was already beginning to gain strength. And one day, perhaps not soon, but inevitably, history would repeat itself. But this time, Andrew will be ready. And he will do everything he can to protect those he cares about and the world they live in.